Right, so we've seen a lot of disgruntled, frankly overly entitled former Labour MPs complaining that voters dared to vote them out. The one thing all of them appear to have latched onto is that their opponents were liars, abusers. Their supporters were bullies. They behaved in an intimidating manner towards us. The truth of the matter was, their party won a landslide in the general election, so them losing their seats ought to tell them a period of self-reflection is in order. Well, things are taking a darker turn now, as those candidates who were successful, those independents who, against all the odds under a first-past-the-post voting system, who won their seats by deposing a Labour MP, may in fact be blocked from running again, as well as any other independents due to said accusations, and also due to the nature of these independents having won in no small part by having stood on a platform of being pro-Palestine and pro-Gaza, now have the Israel lobby demanding the current set of independent MPs and their supporters be designated as extremists. Is the country about to see the level of authoritarianism they were warned would come under a Starmer government finally, and with that same government so reliant on Israel lobby donations, can they afford to not do as instructed, and to what ends for us all? Right, so for all the bellyaching we've seen from the likes of Jonathan Ashworth or Thangham Debonnaire or Khalid Mahmood as examples, who lost their seats in the general election, blaming their opponents and generally acting like a bunch of sore Labour losers, which they are, failing to stand up for their constituents, for which they've been punished. They've been given their marching orders. You lost. It's a contest. It's an election. The job isn't yours by default. You have to actually do all the work. Represent the people who voted you in, not get away with slavish ambition for your own ends and toe the party line all the time and expect people to keep backing you just because you wear a red rosette. It might have worked for others, but it didn't for you, and it shouldn't work that way for anyone. But then, this is why they won't change the electoral system any more than the Tories will, isn't it? But all that moaning and groaning has been amplified, of course, by the media, and is still going even today, with Angela Rayner doing the morning news rounds, having been wheeled out to make claims of abuse when she's hardly one to talk, given her own Tory scum comment once upon a time, no matter if we agree with her assessment of the Tories or not, which I do, as it happens. But then, as a politician, you've then boxed yourself in to appoint other politicians being abused when you've done it yourself. You can't exactly call it out, can you? Except this time, continuing to peddle the line of abuse, violence and intimidation because Labour MPs, your side, lost their seats. Well, hard luck. To Labour, this is the only explanation that these people lost their seats. And all of a sudden, it's not about the fact several of these MPs had large numbers of Muslim constituents disgusted at Labour's abject positioning in favour of Israel over Gaza. That is the issue. But instead, a viewpoint is being woven that will again reflect disproportionately on Muslim communities when they are not alone in being disgusted at the situation in Gaza in this country. And the new government's clear loyalties to Israel remain just as firm, if not firmer, than they were under the Tories. But they will now be scapegoated as the abusers and the intimidators, completely unfairly, because they chose to take their votes elsewhere. And this is Labour's hierarchy of racism now polluting their governance of the UK. Islamophobia, it clearly would be, and that, even worse, could end up written into law yet, because I haven't even got on to the Israel's lobby's role in all of this quite yet. For this, we have to turn now to the government's advisor on political violence. We've heard this phrase, political violence, during the rounds a bit the last few days, haven't we? The condemnation of political violence over the shooting of Donald Trump, for example, by numerous government ministers. But equally, it gets a free pass where Israel and Gaza are concerned, because where Benjamin Netanyahu faces an arrest warrant for war crimes, not only has our Foreign Secretary David Lammy already gone to Israel now to press the flesh with him, but after going into the general election saying they would withdraw the Tories' legal attempt to block the arrest warrant against Netanyahu, Labour have now U-turned, following David Lammy giving Israel assurances over it, and are now going to see it through. Well, the independent advisor to the government on political violence and disruption is a guy called Lord Walney, and he held the same role under the Tories. Labour are more than happy to keep using him, apparently. He was, after all, a former Labour MP. The former Labour MP for Barrow-in-Furness, John Woodcock, once upon a time, as he was called. So independent is a little bit of a stretch, isn't it? Whether you call him Walney or Woodcock, though, he's very much Starmer's faction. Though given what he's coming out with here, he might see Starmer's authoritarianism as being too much of a soft touch, perhaps. And actually, it says it all that a former Labour MP took an advisory position and a peerage in the Boris Johnson 2019 dissolution honours list as a non-affiliated life peer, which read as a who's who of right-wing former Labour MPs. But the reason for him being a former Labour MP, though, ought to have been a point of consideration for Starmer before reappointing Woodcock to the same advisory position on political violence, because if we're going to talk about violence and abuse, then Woodcock ought to have had the investigation against him, the allegations of sexual harassment made against him in 2018, which led to his suspension from the Labour Party, completed. Since this was an internal Labour Party investigation, Woodcock chose to quit the party, preventing the investigation ever being seen through. Read into that what you will, but the fact the Tories appointed him to be an independent advisor on political violence and disruption was seen by many to be a pretty sick joke. And that Starmer has kept him on doesn't exactly scream the change he stood on an election platform of. But Woodcock, or Walney, however you want to refer to him as, is also an ardent supporter of Israel, was, as a Labour MP, a former chair of Labour Friends of Israel, and also the chair of Progress, the Blairite faction within Labour. He has absolutely benefited from going on paid junkets on several occasions to the apartheid state, most recently in January of this year, whilst of course they were in the midst of their assault on Gaza, and while South Africa was taking them to court at the ICJ. He also has ties to the arms lobby as well, again making you question his suitability to adjudicate matters relating to violence. He was the paid chair of the Purpose Defence Coalition, whose website is now down, so I'm not sure whether it's now defunct, whether they're still a thing, but members of which included Leonardo, who, one of the world's largest arms manufacturers, with ties of its own to Israel. He also campaigned as a Labour MP against Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister in the 2017 general election, alongside his fellow former Labour MP, in name only of course, turned peer under the Tories Ian Austin, on the basis that Corbyn was apparently a threat to the renewal of the Trident nuclear arms deterrent, despite the fact Labour Conference backed renewal and Corbyn, unlike Starmer, actually respected Conference's sovereignty. So could there possibly be a guy less suited to the role he currently has? Well, you decide. But at any rate, he's now coming for our newly elected independent MPs, apparently, which of course now includes Jeremy Corbyn again. 5 independent MPs who defeated Labour candidates, including a number of incumbent MPs, could now end up being labelled as extremists off the back of the allegations of abuse being bandied around constantly by sore losers who ignore their constituents and got given their marching orders as a result, and the media who keep platforming them. In the case of John Ashworth, who lost his Leicester South seat, a piece of video footage that went viral on social media of him being asked questions by his constituents who he was running away from, not wishing to engage and excuse his words and his deeds, was subsequently arrested on terror offences. And this has disturbing connotations as the director of CAGE, the anti-repression organisation in relation to counter-terrorism measures, which calls out the abuse of such measures, as often proves to be this case, said on this. The first few days of a Starmer-led government has seen the arrest of an anti-genocide activist in Leicester, the arrests of 7 students protesting Israeli genocide at the SOAS encampment, and continuing silence in the wake of increasing Israeli slaughter of Palestinians with the full political and military support of Britain. Despite the change of party, it's business as usual. Like Julian Assange, the only crime Majid Freeman is guilty of is exposing Western complicity in genocide. The establishment's Al Capone tactics of intimidation will not work. The people will continue to stand with the Palestinian resistance against Western-sponsored Israeli genocide. All the guy did was expose Ashworth for all to see. After horrendous comments and an unforgivable voting record on Gaza, it was Ashworth who blew his 23,000 vote majority. Nobody else did it for him. Sadly, we've not seen the last of this, and in fact we could be about to see independent candidates who showed themselves to be so successful potentially recalled, removed, and independent candidates actually banned from standing for Parliament in future, concreting in party politics only. Disenfranchising even more voters as that would, an abuse of Starmer's majority as that would be, earned off the back of the lowest turnout as that was at a general election since the end of universal suffrage nearly 100 years ago. As Walney has asked Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and Security Minister Dan Jarvis to conduct an inquiry on it. Squawkbox have picked up on this too. Here's an excerpt from their piece. Campaigners told Squawkbox that they believe that rather than address the concerns of anti-genocide campaigners, which would require a change of course over the support of successive UK governments for Israel's war crimes, the establishment plans to criminalise independents and use this as an excuse for exploiting Starmer's huge unearned parliamentary majority to force recall petitions to remove the independents as MPs and to proscribe campaigns that attempt to hold right-wing MPs to account. The Labour right already has formed for this, targeting Muslim woman MP Afsana Begum for prosecution over fictitious housing fraud, happily the attempt was thrown out of court. Liverpool's then Mayor Joe Anderson was also removed as mayor after being arrested over alleged fraud and bribery, then quietly de-arrested, and the investigation dropped once the coup had been completed. The right may also be planning to make allegations to an election court in the hope of disqualifying the independent MPs and rerun the elections. Yvette Cooper and Dan Jarvis, like half of Keir Starmer's cabinet, including Starmer himself, have accepted donations from pro-Israel lobbyists. Starmer, a long-time servant of the British security state, has reportedly told the Israeli regime via Foreign Secretary David Lammy that the UK will try to prevent the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes. If you wondered how powerful and how in hoc to the arms and Israel lobbies Starmer's government are, well, it's all here to see. And if they push ahead with this utterly undemocratic idiocy, there needs to be a concerted pushback. It's bad enough when our votes don't count in our stupid electoral system, but ignoring them after they do count, then that isn't democracy anymore. That's a dictatorship. Meanwhile, here's more on the story of Starmer and David Lammy seeking to get Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant off the hook for war crimes at the International Criminal Court to what should be national shame and outrage. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.